whether we like it or not, and I think this is borne out certainly by the Chile affair, the CIA in taking action, whether it's in the Bay of Pigs, whether it's in Laos, or political action as in Chile, very early stages, as you know, after the war, in Italy, in Tehran, etc. These have all been done at the instruction of the President and the NSC. Now, to oversimplify the question, I would say that the CIA has been a third arm, diplomatic and military first, of a most stupid, uncreative, and failing American policy toward the rest of the world since 1948. And that when you take the covert or the overt, the Dominican Republic, the Bay of Pigs, Vietnam, this very deep-seated, visceral, and I think stupid anti-communist, anti-Soviet policy without any shadings whatever, have made us the fools we are, because we try to solve the problem of the Soviet communist threat by shenanigans or by war or by military forces. This has proved a failure. And we're now at the end of 30 years of a failed policy in which CIA operations have contributed, as the military, as the State Department have, and that it is now time, and I agree with Sy to this extent, you can go over all the recriminations, all the exposures, the Pentagon, CIA, NSA, White House for the last 25 years. But what's even more important is what's going on today and how can we change that to have a more effective voice and action abroad. Because we have done a lousy job.
John Marks, do you think that Harry's formulation lets the CIA off the hook a little too easily, or do you think it's basically the way you see it?
Well, I don't think that the CIA overthrows a government or carries on a major project overseas without the permission, in fact, the direction of the White House. I mean, Sy did a marvelous bit of investigative reporting when he found out one of the censored lines from our book on the Chile thing. One of the lines the CIA had censored, but it's Henry Kissinger sitting in the White House in 1970 at a 40 committee meeting on Chile, and Kissinger says, "I don't see why we need to let a country go communist just because of the irresponsibility of its own people." And, you know, and that is a true statement, a true quote, I can assure you, though I can't tell you about it because I'm under a court injunction not to. I'm quoting Sy, I'm not quoting my book.
But Harry Fuel.
But the whole premise with the CIA is that it has been an arm of the presidency and the executive branch, but one that it doesn't have to be accounted for, one that's outside of the system of checks and balances. I mean, the CIA comes along with Air Force One and the Secret Service. It's one of the perquisites of being the President of the United States. But it's had the advantage of being deniable to the President. In other words, if something goes wrong, the President can say he had nothing to do about it. And we've had some curious situations over the last 25 years as a result. We find every president since Eisenhower being caught in a public lie about the CIA. Eisenhower lied in 1958 about the CIA's involvement trying to overthrow Sukarno in Indonesia. He lied in 1960 about the U-2 and perhaps opened up the credibility gap. Kennedy lied about the Bay of Pigs. Johnson lied about the CIA's involvement in Indochina, and Nixon lied about virtually everything, but among other things, he lied about the CIA in Chile and the CIA in Indochina. And I think we have to ask ourselves, what kind of institution is it at the heart of American government that causes presidents of the United States to lie? And if the credibility gap is a big problem, and if people's lack of faith in their leaders is a big problem, it seems to me that the CIA is right up there at the top of the list because it's a built-in system for lying. I mean, every covert operation has something written into it called a cover story. They call it in the CIA plausible deniability. Well, laymen call plausible deniability lying. And that's what the CIA is about in its interface with the American public and the American press. And I think that having that kind of institution has to do harm to our society.
Well, what solution is there for it? What substitute or what remedies or reforms?
I think we need, the President of the United States has a right to good intelligence about things like Soviet missiles and Chinese nuclear testing and things of that sort. And most of the information that you need for that kind of to get that kind of data comes from machines now. It comes from satellites, it comes from radar and sensors and code breaking and things which are very expensive and perhaps, definitely much too secretive, but which have nothing to do with secret agents or having people trained in second-story skills and sending them overseas. The CIA's had a singular lack of success in recruiting people who can tell us about things like what the North Vietnamese are doing, what the Chinese are doing, and what the Soviets are doing. The machines and the open sources provide most of the information, and there is no reason why we can't have those machines, though they shouldn't cost so much. But we don't need the people. We do not need people who take courses that are called, well, they have one that's called locks and picks, and another one that's called flaps and seals. That's how you open letters and things of that sort. And that's what our government is training people to do. Sometimes they use those skills against psychiatrists' office in Los Angeles. Sometimes they use them overseas. And it seems to me that those kind of criminal activities could be eliminated with no loss to the country if you look on them on a purely cost-effective, pragmatic basis. You'll find that the CIA hasn't done that much for the country. Now, forgetting about the violation of international law, the violation of domestic law, the morality and everything else, but just on purely pragmatic grounds, you can't make a very strong case for the CIA.
John,
so I think that what we need is an intelligence service that has a lot of analysts sitting around, reading satellite reports, reading newspapers, giving the President of the United States the best possible information, but we don't need the dirty tricks.
Harry?
John, could I interpose a question of fact? How do you achieve the notion that espionage, meaning the production of reports from secret agents, not from spy satellites, has been of no value to the U.S. government for the last 25 years? Because all I can say is it contributes very little. Here and there, a secret agent in a time of action, Near East War, etc., can contribute a report or two, which does enlighten the policymakers. Now, it's silly to talk about Penkovsky's contribution to Kennedy's state of mind in evaluating Soviet missile capabilities, and also his awareness of exactly what missile system was being put into Cuba. Here was a man who had the documents, who gave all the information needed to at least put a perspective on, let us say, Soviet-American strength. A spy satellite can't really get at the kind of conversations we can report from Brezhnev himself or the Central Committee in Moscow. We are visiting foreign communists, some of whom, I'm glad to report, we have recruited over the years, come back and tell us what the old boy's state of mind was, what instructions he gave them, what their feelings were about the progress of Communist Party and Cuban business in Latin America, etc. Now, I'm not trying to suggest this is an overwhelming, I suppose, 1 out of 100 useful reports in Washington come from secret agents. And incidentally, I have never picked a lock, and I have almost always worked on the first story because the best intelligence comes from fairly sophisticated guys who have access to the classified information in certain third world countries where the Soviets are active, or in some cases directly out of Moscow. So from that point of view, you have to have an open mind, because I can't prove any more than I can disprove, or John can, what these contributions have been. But if you don't leave it to the executive to decide what kind of information he wants, then you might as well strip him of all his powers.
Harry, all the evidence was that in Southeast Asia, the CIA, as well as all the other American intelligence gathering organizations, were doing an absolutely miserable job of telling us what was going on in Hanoi.
No argument whatever. No argument whatever.
So, I think what we need, perhaps, is some really good reporting on just how good a job the CIA is doing at those things which many of us feel are legitimate functions. I have a feeling they're doing a miserable job.
But the tragedy is that the only people you can ask are people within the executive. You'll naturally assume they're covering up and trying to blow up the brilliant performance of the Secret Service, and therefore you can't believe them. You certainly aren't going to ask a congressman to find out what intelligence through secret agents has contributed to the U.S. Welfare in the last 25 years.
Well, I think that the perspective of people who've been in the inside and now have perhaps changed their mind can be brought to bear. My co-author on our book, Marchetti, was for 14 years in the heart of the CIA, the last 5 years in the director's office as a staff person. And he reports that there were not reports coming from Moscow that gave you a good idea of what the intentions of Brezhnev were. I mean, that's your ideal, I suppose, intelligence agent, one who's in the Kremlin men's room and can give that kind of information, but it wasn't coming in. There is one exception, and that's Penkovsky, and that's an interesting one to go into. I mean, Penkovsky approached the CIA in the late 1950s and said, I want to spy for you folks. And the CIA said, are you kidding us? We're not that dumb. I mean, we know about provocations and deception and everything else. And he got turned down flat by the CIA. He then had contact made with him by the British. The British hired Penkovsky, came back to the CIA and said, we've got a live wire inside the Kremlin. Do you want to share in the take? And the CIA, rather anxious at that point, said sure. And the British said, but you'll have to pay. So we had to buy back from the British the information from Penkovsky. We gave them satellite photos in return for Penkovsky. And Marchetti knows that because he was there, and that happened. So Penkovsky spies for 18 months, supplies an awful lot of useful information to intelligence analysts about what's going on in the Soviet Union. He gets caught and executed. The CIA cannot resist further exploiting this thing, so they write a book called the Penkovsky Papers, which is published in the United States as the reputed journal of Oleg Penkovsky. It was a fraud. The CIA wrote that book. I mean, they used a lot of the information that Penkovsky had sent in, but they put a lot of garbage in there with the real information, and it was a fake. And it was a propaganda operation, and the target was the American people. I mean, because that's who bought the Penkovsky Papers, that's who put it on the bestseller list. So we had an agency of our own government propagandizing us, giving us false information, so I assume we would have attitudes that would support their kind of work.
There have been many, many government agencies involved in the domestic intelligence business. And the CIA has been getting a lot of the blame for domestic activities. But actually the CIA was only a very small part of what was going on. It turns out that virtually every police force in the country had an intelligence division. In New York it's called the Bureau of Special Services, but most people just refer to them as Red Squads. And these local police intelligence squads have been spying on virtually everybody in the country to the left of Hubert Humphrey. And I mean anti-war activists, civil rights activists, community people, just everybody who wanted some sort of change. And we've had police scandals now where this kind of activity has come out in Baltimore, in Dallas, in Houston, in Chicago. Members of Congress were under surveillance. And, just most every activist in the whole city. And so the local police were doing this. Then the FBI was spying on these same sorts of people for the same kinds of reasons. And we've seen some of the files, some of the FBI files now that have been released under the Freedom of Information Act. And it turns out that just working level black activists, for instance, were under very, very heavy FBI surveillance that lasts 5 to 10 years. And this kind of things, people in the civil rights movement, people in the anti-war movement. And the FBI, in addition to all that surveillance, had what was known as the counterintelligence program, or in FBI language, COINTELPRO. And COINTELPRO was a program to disrupt and interfere with activist organizations in this country. And so under this program, the FBI was taking actions not attributable to the FBI to disrupt. I mean, some of the things the FBI did was to write a letter to a faculty tenure committee out at Arizona State University when an anti-war professor named Morris Starsky's appointment was coming up for renewal. And the FBI anonymous letters made all sorts of scurrilous charges about Professor Starsky, and it was sent to every member of the board that was going to decide whether to fire or retain Professor Starsky, and he was fired. Similarly, a civil rights activist in Mississippi got an anonymous letter from the FBI warning him to leave the area, or implying that his life would be in danger. We never saw Efrain Zimbalist Jr. writing anonymous letters to people on the FBI show on television, but the FBI was into this in a major way. Beyond that, the CIA had something called Operation Chaos, which was a program to infiltrate and to spy on the domestic activist group, anti-war civil rights and people of that sort. The CIA has claimed that it was trying to find out if these people had foreign ties, but over the years the CIA never found any of these so-called foreign ties, and the Rockefeller Commission, which was not an unfriendly group to the CIA, saw that the CIA program in Operation Chaos was clearly illegal. The FBI was the FBI and the CIA together were opening mail in this country. The Internal Revenue Service had a special bureau which was looking up the tax returns and gathering intelligence on people who were politically opposed to the Nixon administration. So, I'm just giving you a part of it, but there were just many, many, many government agencies that were spying on American citizens over the last decade.
As far as Operation Chaos, the Rockefeller Commission report quoted a memo that was issued by then Director of CIA Richard Helms. And in it he said, "Chaos is a legitimate counterintelligence function of the agency and cannot be stopped simply because some members of the organization do not like this activity." Could you comment on that?
Well, I say even the Rockefeller Commission, which was not unfriendly to the CIA, did not find it to be a legitimate activity. It found it to be, in many cases, illegal, and it certainly was outside the provision of law which limits the CIA from having any domestic police or internal security functions. I think that Mr. Helms was just putting down onto paper a rationalization that couldn't stand the light of day, and now when it's hit the light of day, I think it's just been exposed as being something that's worthless. And, of course, Mr. Helms is somebody who, when he testified before Congress in 1973, and he was asked under oath whether the CIA had the domestic program of this sort, he denied it. And Mr. Helms is being investigated by the Justice Department for perjury for that statement in front of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. So, I'm not sure we're going to take his word as too important.
What about the FBI? Was there a similar attitude towards their program there?
The FBI felt justified in everything that it was doing. The difference is with the FBI is that not all of it was on its face illegal, as with the CIA. In other words, there's no FBI prohibition from collecting domestic intelligence. Now, the FBI in many cases may have gone beyond the law in the use of wiretaps or the use of informants, but in general, what they were doing was at least within the framework of what the FBI is supposed to be doing. We can argue whether the FBI should be collecting any domestic intelligence at all, and I don't think they should be in the sense of political activities. I think the FBI should limit itself to investigating crimes, espionage being a crime too. But the FBI's attitude essentially was that dissent in this country was a threat to the established order, and that meant people who wanted to end the war or people who felt that blacks should have equal rights. Now, I'm sure that J. Edgar Hoover would not get up and say blacks should not have equal rights, but on the other hand, he did launch a major campaign of harassment against Dr. Martin Luther King and the rest of the civil rights movement. And at the same time that Martin Luther King was receiving a Nobel Peace Prize, Dr. King was under constant FBI surveillance. His hotel rooms were tapped all around the country. And J. Edgar Hoover was trying to leak scurrilous information on Martin Luther King to any newsmen who would take it. And to their credit, no newspaper published any of this stuff. But that didn't mean J. Edgar Hoover wasn't using the fruits of this surveillance as much as he could to discredit Martin Luther King.
A lot of people assume that this type of information is still laying around in a computer somewhere. What do you think about that?
Oh, that information is very much still laying around. Hoover's files, which I would guess have more dirt and more scurrilous information than any other files in the United States government, still exist. Now, under a new regime, the Attorney General Levy is supposed to have a study going on what to do with this information. Some of it can't be destroyed, but those files still are there. Military intelligence in 1971 was told to get out of the domestic intelligence business. In fact, Secretary Laird issued a directive saying there would be no more military spying on civilians in these countries, and the records were supposed to be destroyed. Apparently, most of those records are still in computer banks somewhere in the country. And you would get one agency to destroy a file or two, but you find out that all the information in that file has been fed by computer tie-ins to other agencies. And I don't think there's very much information that the government's gathered in the last 10 years that's ever been destroyed.
Do you think that these programs or programs like these are continuing today?
I don't think that you will find the very active programs against opposition groups in this country. for several reasons. One, the heat's on. I mean, there's all these congressional committees supposedly studying what the intelligence community is doing. You have an aroused press, a semi-aroused public, and the heat is on to some extent. And these agencies, for the most part, I do not think want the aggravation at this point, September 1975, of getting caught in the act. I mean, I think that the kind of very objectionable, very abusive activities that we're protesting the most about have more or less stopped for the present. I think the political atmosphere is very different now than it was a year or two ago. I mean, Nixon is not in the White House anymore, and there's not that super paranoia in the highest part of the government. I mean, Ford, for all his problems, I do not think is a mean man, and I do not think is making vindictive orders against the left or the anti-war protesters. There's no war anymore, for another thing. And the mood's different. I mean, the college kids just seem to want to listen to music and boogie. I mean, you don't have anti-war protests. You don't have political protest on the campuses. And, the government is not nearly as concerned now as it was a few years ago. So I don't think there's the impulse from the government to do it, and I think then also there's a fear among certain government people about getting caught at this point. But the basic apparatus still exists. The intelligence agencies are still there, every bit as prepared to be abusive as they were in the late 60s and early 70s. The people who are in these security agents, for the most part, think that dissent should be equated with being a traitor, with disloyalty. I mean, in other words, people aren't just against the war, they're against the country. And, I mean, I don't agree with that, but I think people who are intelligence agencies and police agencies do tend to believe that. And so I think the threat is still very much there to us, but I don't think there is a very immediate problem at this point, for instance, of all groups in the country that are working for social change being automatically infiltrated. Some of them are infiltrated and everything, but I don't think it's as bad as it was before.
What do you think are the ultimate effects of operations such as Chaos or COINTELPRO or the Houston Plan?
Well, that's very hard to say. I mean, I'm sure it has some effect. I mean, I don't think that it completely knocked out the left in this country. I mean, I think the left in this country did probably as much to knock itself out as the government agencies. But in any case, I think the government agencies were successful in sowing distrust, in perhaps getting organizations to go down paths that were very unproductive. I mean, we've seen in cases like the Camden one, where a government agent, a government provocateur, was really responsible for the action that got the group in trouble. Now, I don't think that's true in every case in the country, but it does seem that the government agents in Harrisburg, for instance, were the people who were always trying to get things going. I mean, I have a friend here who was at the Institute for Policy Studies, which was the subject of great amounts of government surveillance and infiltration. And the guy they later found out to be an infiltrator was the guy who was always saying he had bombs, and would they like to find out something about machine guns and things of that sort. But I mean, I don't think that too much of this was really very serious in the sense that it wasn't adopted by most groups. And I mean, I think the government had some effect in stopping dissent in this country, but it didn't stop the anti-war movement. It just made things rather difficult at times for it.
As a British citizen, deeply concerned, not only as one sympathetic to liberation movements, I believe that on a realistic basis, we have to recognise the necessity of coming to terms with the new forces which are in fact going to take over in the third world and the world as a whole in the course of the next generation. And all the denunciation of these rising forces as subversives, as aggressors in their own countries, will not cause them to disappear. It is, as Philip said, appropriate that we meet on the 18th of April 1975, because on the previous 18th of April, 200 years ago, to which he referred, there was a clash between a group of dangerous subversives who were threatening a lawful and established system of government. And the subversives were in fact the troublemakers like Paul Revere and Sam Adams and John Hancock, whose inflammatory actions led General Gage at that time, a good Englishman and true, so the history books always taught me, to dispatch a detachment of redcoats to arrest them and seize the rebel arms exactly 200 years ago. Now, it may have been unfortunate, but General Gage never had the CIA to assist him. He had certain intelligence gatherers, and some say that Benjamin Church, who was a member of the Massachusetts Provincial Congress at the time, had an expensive mistress whose financial difficulties could be eased by trading information. But anyway, even then it wasn't successful, because the struggle that took place 200 years ago tomorrow on Lexington Common was followed by 7 years of war, which demonstrated for Britain, as long ago as 1782, the pitfalls of military intervention in foreign lands. And although unfortunately we've had to have that lesson taught to us again on several occasions, today there is the biggest example in history being taught by a small country of struggling people against the most powerful nation in the world. And that is a very, very dramatic lesson indeed, of which we should take notice. Of course, since 1775, techniques have improved, and the primary way of influencing governments, as we've heard this evening, is initially by influencing and penetrating the institutions, the trade unions, the media, the armed forces, even the sports clubs, as Philip has made it clear to us. And the CIA, we must confess, is second to none in this particular role. But the facts of the situation, it's interesting, are no longer being denied. And I have a cutting here from the Times of the 8th of April 1975, in which it refers to Mr. William Colby in a statement that he made at a meeting of publishers and editors, where he defended the CIA practice of aiding foreign politicians. There are occasions, he said, in which some quiet assistance to friends of America in some foreign country can help them withstand hostile internal pressures before they become international pressures against the United States. Well, you may recall that some quiet, gentle assistance was rendered in 1953 to the Shah of Iran, in 1954 to Castillo Armas in Guatemala, later on in the Congo, later on to opponents of Chedi Jagan, which has already been referred to this evening, and finally, most recently, to those who objected to the policies of Dr. Allende in Chile. And we know that there are countless other examples which are available of these examples of quiet assistance being handed out. And there can be no doubt whatsoever of the degree of penetration of an enormous variety of institutions and the lubrication of activities through those institutions by finances disposed in all sorts of ways, but preeminently through bogus foundations. And all of us must be aware at this stage that despite this special relationship that we're always told exists between the United States of America and Great Britain, that we ourselves in Britain have not been immune from this gentle attention, and it's time, in fact, that we gave it a little more thought. The Congress of Cultural Freedoms, which produced the encounter edited by Melvin Lasky in the early days, received from Thomas Braden money to keep it going. Thomas Braden said how he was proud that some of the CIA money went to pay for the tour of the Boston Symphony Orchestra at that time through Europe. There was the penetration of the student movement, particularly through use of the San Jacinto Fund and the Foundation for Youth and Student Affairs, which subsidized the United States National Students Association and therefore the International Student Conference, to which our own NUS was of course affiliated. And the World Assembly of Youth received CIA money. There have also been massive attempts to suborn and influence the international labour movement. And Thomas Braden, the CIA agent whom I've already quoted, has stated how in the years immediately after the war, he gave $50,000 to Walter Reuther to subsidise West German trade unions. And Walter Reuther apparently afterwards, he confirmed this. But he said that they didn't do it again, and his brother Victor refused to become a CIA agent when they attempted to recruit him subsequently. The AFL and CIO, Department of International Affairs, was directed after 1963 by J. Lovestone, who had the advantage of having been a previous General Secretary of the American Communist Party. And it dispensed a huge overseas budget and assisted in the establishment through the ICFTU of trade secretariats, trade unions and trade internationals which were penetrated through and through by CIA-linked officials. And coming on to the question which was raised early on by somebody over here about Guyana, it's now established that the Public Services International received monies via Arnold Zander, founder of the Federation of State, County and Municipal Employees, an American trade union, who obtained the money via the bogus Gotham Foundation from the CIA and subsequently paid it into the Guyanese trade unions when they were carrying on their strike against Cheddi Jagan through Howard McCabe, who was the United States representative on the Public Services International based here in London. Other organisations in the trade union movement, which it's almost certain had connections with the CIA, were the International Federation of Clerical and Technical Employees, the International Federation of Journalists, the American Institute of Free Labour Development, the Afro-American Labour Centre, the International American Labour Organisation, the International Federation of Petroleum and Chemical Workers, the Postal Telegraph and Telephone International, and many others. The European movement itself initially received money from United States sources. And in fact, the idea of Britain going into Europe was pushed particularly in the early stages as part of American foreign policy. And huge amounts of monies have been dispensed to further that particular cause. And finally, of course, London is an extremely important centre for contacts with people from the third world. And when in fact, as somebody raised the question of the Middle East over here, it is, I understand, true that when, in fact, Sultan Qaboos, who now is ruling Oman, where unfortunately British troops are still being used, to my very, very considerable regret, to help to suppress a liberation movement, he came to London and he has contacts. The CIA undoubtedly had contacts with him. Richard Helms did go to Israel. And of course, we know the links that exist in the case of Iran, which has itself an extremely efficient secret police organisation, the SAVAK, which some time ago, some of you may recall, we were seeking to get publicity for when it sought to recruit the wife of a student leader, Terry Povey, to do intelligence work for them in this country. Now, the British government, unfortunately Labour and Conservative, have cherished the notion of the special relationship between Great Britain and the United States of America. But this relationship, based on the policies which are expressed at the present time by Dr. Henry Kissinger, are, in my view, worse than useless. This is worse than useless and actually harmful to the interests, basically the long-term interests of the people of the United States and this country alike. It's a relationship which depends upon covert pressures and activities, and in the long run will do definite damage. Now, there is a new spirit abroad, I believe, in the United States, which is reflected in the United States Congress as well as in the people at large. And I think there's a necessity to establish a new special relationship between those of us who recognise the need for progress in the world and a relationship which does not involve intervention, covert or overt, into the affairs of third world or any other countries. We must fully recognise the rights of national self-determination in all the countries of the world at this stage. Now, there's no question about it that in Britain there is a very large central intelligence establishment here. I believe that in their own interests, as well as the interests of other people, the sooner that these individuals are packed off home and take up some other form of activity, the better it will be for everybody concerned. Now, unfortunately, in seeking to bring this to the attention of the British public, I must confess that on various occasions we have had, those of us who've been interested in this matter, and I must say that I've been interested a very long time, certainly for the past 10 years or more, we've had some difficulty in getting the active support of our free press in this country. I'm sure it's perfectly accidental, but I want to say this, that I understood it must have been because I was quite dense, that there was going to be a front page coverage given to this on the date of the 6th of March 1975. Well, I've got in my hand here a telephone message here which suggested from a reporter, you were right, the editor killed it. But that was a very honourable paper, and what I must quote here quite honestly to tell you those true facts. Dear Mr. Newins, what you say about The Guardian is untrue. Was never due to publish a story about CIA agents, nor was front page space ever reserved for it. No senior member of the staff, nor any of those who planned the front page, knew of the reporter's activities that day, nor was there ever any question of front page treatment. And of course, as that letter is signed by a gentleman who is most concerned about the real danger, I'm sure you're all concerned about, of the of the Labour Party's legislation, how it might affect the freedom of the press in our country, I'm sure that you'll realise there must be a very, very good basis indeed for that. Again, I want to tell you a little story about the Observer. Sorry, it slipped out. Again, I read in the when I was in Britain in 1967, interested in these questions, I read that a young woman who was had been killed with the second column of Che Guevara in Bolivia, Tanya Bunker, had been discovered to be an East German spy, and accordingly she'd been dropped completely from the news in Cuba. She was then a non-person. And furthermore, the Observer was going to publish a supplement to reveal the secret love life and connection she had with Che Guevara and how she inveigled him and then betrayed him. Now, I happened to go to Cuba, and I happened to be at the opening of a school, and on the platform, on the very day that this supplement was published, exposing this dropping of Tanya Bunker, Fidel Castro came along to speak to a crowd of, I should think, 100,000 people to open a school. And sitting next to him on the platform, there was Frau Bunker and her bunker just by the side. And in case they were incognito, during the course of it, Fidel had just begun to speak and it started to rain. So, of course, coming from the GDR, where people are very, very neat and tidy all the way, Frau Bunker actually got her umbrella open and attempted to put it over Fidel like this. He put his arm round her and said, "Comrades, this comrade who's trying to put an umbrella over me is the mother of Tanya Bunker, who died fighting with Che in Bolivia in 1967. And they all applauded and applauded and applauded, you see. And then Fidel plonked her down, pushed his umbrella on one side and proceeded to speak for the next 3.5 hours in the rain, and we all got soaked. But the position was this. When I got home and I saw on this very day that this lurid piece had been published, I thought that I would write to the Observer and point out that they appeared to have got something wrong. Well, I didn't hear anything in my letter, and then I phoned and the rest of it and so on, and they said, well, they had got it from somewhere, and they couldn't really answer where it was, and it was by a gentleman by the name of Daniel James, who lives down Mexico way. Well, those of you who are students of this subject will be aware that he also had certain connections in the past. And the fact of the matter, then the Observer decided they hadn't got room for publishing a letter after 3 or 4 weeks by a Member of Parliament like me being there, but they would publish one after all by Brian Pollitt, which they did subsequently, who'd also been in Cuba and had written. But nonetheless, I was somewhat surprised because I've often found that these things on the CIA don't seem to make newsworthy matters in this country. So I and my colleagues want to say that we intend to pursue this matter relentlessly and right the way through at the present moment. I've written to Harold Wilson on this issue. I've placed the information, some information before him, and I'm hoping that we shall have the opportunity, some of us, my colleagues, to see him. I'm delighted at the news of the inquiries which are going on in the United States at the present time, because I think that the body, the CIA, is an utterly pernicious body, and I believe myself that it's high time that we ourselves saw to it that the activities of this body in this country are brought to a close. And I want to say to you, therefore, finally, any of you here this evening who are serious about this, I want to reiterate what Philip Agee said, that we can do something about it. And I want, therefore, to say to all of you that I hope that you will protest and you will write letters and you will demand of the government, of your own members of Parliament, that in fact we stop this infiltration and this thoroughly pernicious activity which has gone on all too long. We may have many faults in this country. I personally am opposed to the KGB, the SAVAK or Bosch from South Africa or anybody else seeking to suborn our way of life in this country. I want the British people to determine the way that we go forward. I'm opposed to anybody attempting to do this by covert measures. And I believe that at this time, one of the biggest operations is that carried on by the CIA, and therefore that's why I and many of my colleagues are delighted to be able to speak out and to hear others speak out, and we intend to go on speaking out until in fact we end this and we do embark upon a decent foreign policy which is in the interest ultimately not only of the people of this country but the people of the Americas and the people of the world as a whole.
On behalf of 4 radicals in San Diego, California, I mailed a letter to the Church Committee, the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, which documents a 5-year campaign directed by the FBI using a terrorist right-wing organization against the entire radical left, anti-Nixon, anti-war movement in San Diego. The most outrageous FBI abuses, which are documented in the letter, and by the way, they are established without any doubt, concern 3 FBI informer and agent plots to assassinate Peter Boehmer, who was a radical economics professor at San Diego State College before he was fired. One night in January 1972, Howard Berry Godfrey, who had been an FBI informer since 1967, drove by Boehmer's residence in Ocean Beach in San Diego, along with Mickey Hoover, who was also an SAO member, and the 2 of them fired 2 shots into Boehmer's residence, one of which struck Paula Tharp, a woman who lived in the house, in the elbow and permanently injured her arm. After the shooting, the FBI, which had known of Godfrey's violent propensities and indeed had funded all of his SAO activities, hid the gun in the home of one of its agents and refused to disclose any information about the shooting to the San Diego Police Department, which was investigating it. The second assassination plot occurred a few months later in the spring of 1972, when an FBI and San Diego Police Department informer named Gil Romero and a San Diego police officer called Jesus Lopez, agreed on a plot to draw Boehmer to the hills outside Tijuana, Mexico, where Boehmer would be shot by Mexican federales. That plot was never executed, only because Romero was publicly revealed to be an informer before it could be carried out. The third plot surfaced only last week, when another FBI informer named John Raspberry was interviewed on an NBC television affiliate station in San Diego. Raspberry, who said he had been an informer since 1972, and that has since been admitted by the FBI, said that he was assigned specifically to spy on Boehmer, that he infiltrated a group known as the Center for Radical Education, a group in which Boehmer was active, that he opened and stole Boehmer's mail, that at FBI direction he attempted to get Boehmer to buy from him illegal M16 rifles so that Boehmer could be arrested on illegal weapons charges, and finally, and probably most serious, that he discussed on several occasions with his FBI superiors plans and details of how to assassinate, get rid of, eliminate Boehmer. Raspberry said that had he been given a specific order as to when and how he should have killed Boehmer, he would have done it. Yet he was never given that order, largely perhaps because in November 1974, he was kicked out of the Center for Radical Education as a suspected informer, information which turned out to be right, because of his offer of M16 rifles to Boehmer, repeated offers, by the way.
That was attorney Peter Young. With me in the studio is Jeff Kay, who reported on the story for KPFK's Evening News. Jeff, you have the actual suit in front of you, and we're going to be reading sections from it.
Right. Back in January of this year, the Peter Boehmer, along with Paula Tharp, who lived with Boehmer, was active in the organizations that Boehmer was in, filed suit against 58 defendants, including Richard Nixon, John Mitchell, Haldeman, the general staff of the Nixon administration, Donald Segretti. Then Gray was also included of the FBI, William Sullivan of the FBI, Richard Helms of the CIA, Colby of the CIA, Kissinger, and various other FBI officials and members, also officers in the San Diego Sheriffs and the local FBI there in San Diego. And what the suit does is lay out in pretty specific terms a chronological account of the alleged intimidation and harassment that, well, it's not alleged, I suppose, it was actual, that Peter Boehmer was subject to. Of course, there have been more recent revelations, but generally these are the sorts of things that the suit spells out, and we're going to be reading from it. In 1967, Howard Godfrey, a member of the Minutemen, an organization whose avowed purpose was to combat by force persons and groups whose members were considered to be subversive, militant, radical, revolutionary, etc., he became a regularly paid informant for the FBI, and under the direction of the FBI and FBI officials rose to leadership position within the Minutemen. And he directed the activities of Minutemen, including also the defendant SAO, that's the Secret Army Association associates. When the Minutemen disbanded in about 1970, Godfrey, acting under the direction of the FBI, influenced, encouraged, and achieved the formation of the SAO, a group having the same purposes as the Minutemen. In 1971, Godfrey assumed leadership of the San Diego chapter of the SAO with another fellow, and they directed the activities of the SAO members. Between 1967 and 1970, also under the direction of the FBI, Godfrey furnished FBI funds and equipment, materials, firearms, and explosives purchased with FBI funds or given to him by the FBI to the Minutemen and to the SAO, Secret Army Association, for use in their activities. Then in 1967 and until 1972, Lou Conde, who is a San Diego businessman and member of the Board of Supervisors, he also furnished equipment, materials, and funds to the Minutemen and the SAO for use in their activities. And the activities of the SAO are described now.
Between 1967 and 72, the defendant FBI officers and other FBI officials directed, ordered, influenced, and encouraged Godfrey to use his positions and influence within the Minutemen and the Secret Army Organization to threaten, harm, intimidate, punish, injure, and subject to surveillance, thefts, and burglaries, shoot, beat, commit assaults and batteries on opponents and critics of the Vietnam War, and to gather and compile private information on opponents and critics, and by these means to furnish it to the FBI. Godfrey did so act pursuant to said directions from the FBI, orders, influence, and encouragement. And between 1967 and 1972, the defendant FBI officials, that is the people who are accused by this suit, and others disseminated the information so gained to the Sheriff's Department, the Police Department, the District Attorney's Office, and other law enforcement agencies, these in the San Diego area, and also private persons and organizations. Between 1967 and 72, the defendant police and sheriff's officers and other such officers knew of, approved, encouraged, condoned, and cooperated in, and assisted such Minutemen and SAO actions. Godfrey's role as an FBI informant and the directions he had been given by the FBI in that regard as described above. Between 1969 and 72, the defendant FBI, police, and sheriff's officers and the Secret Army Organization associates, acting separately and in concert, committed the following acts against the plaintiffs, and each of them all pursuant to a common scheme to harass, intimidate, and harm them.
Right, and now it goes into the specifics of some of the harassments. In 1960 and 1970, Godfrey and other Minutemen members, at the direction of the FBI and police officers who are named in the suit, twice broke into and entered the offices of the San Diego Street Journal, on which Paula Tharp, was a staff member. They vandalized machinery, causing more than $5,000 in damages, the suit says. They stole business and subscription records, threw paint all over the office, fired gunshots into the office, firebombed a car belonging to a reporter who was an associate of Tharp, and they destroyed vending machines owned by the newspaper. Then in early April 1971, police department officers searched the premises at Saratoga Street in San Diego, where both Boehmer and Tharp resided. They told Boehmer that police officers were keeping the classes he was then teaching at the San Diego State College under surveillance. They arrested him on a burglary charge, which was dropped the next day for lack of any evidence, all arbitrarily, discriminatorily, and in bad faith, the suit says, without reasonable or probable cause. On April 12, 1971, Godfrey and other Secret Army Association members, at the direction of the FBI officials and FBI officers named in the suit, dumped tear gas crystals inside a car parked outside Godfrey's home. On May 4th, 1971, unknown SAO members, at the direction of the FBI, made at least two telephone calls to Godfrey's home. The first caller told him, to Boehmer's home. The first caller told Boehmer that, quote, "If anything happens at the Bank of America, we're going to kill you with a bullet in the back of your head." The second caller spoke to one of Boehmer's roommates and said, "Tell Pete if anything happens at the Bank of America, we're going to ship him back to MIT in a pine box." Now, Boehmer is a graduate of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, and on the day of the phone calls, an anti-war demonstration was held at several Bank of America branches in the San Diego area.
In May of 1971, police department officers pressured and persuaded the owner and landlord of Boehmer's residence to evict Boehmer and the other residents therein. As a result, he raised the monthly rate on said premises from $230 to $800 a month, and in this way compelled Boehmer and the other residents to leave. In August of 1971, Donald Zagretti, using the name Don Sims, visited the SAO at the Gunsmoke Ranch in El Cajon, California, where the SAO practiced shooting. And apparently, Zagretti and the SAO discussed plans for preventing opposition and criticism to the Republican National Convention planned in San Diego at that time in 1972. In September of 1971, the FBI, representatives of the FBI, the Secret Service, the Sheriff's Department, and the San Diego Police Department and other law enforcement agencies met in San Diego, developed plans for surveillance, infiltration, and disruption of opponents and critics of the Vietnam War, and particularly of Boehmer and the other plaintiffs in this suit.
Also, the same month, in September 71, police department officers from San Diego met in San Diego at one of the homes of the officers and discussed implementation of such plans. They briefed undercover agents and informants, and they agreed that the plaintiffs, that's Boehmer and Paula Tharp, should be specific and primary targets of such surveillance and disruption. In 1971, FBI and police department officers furnished private and other information about Peter Boehmer from their confidential records to officials at the San Diego State College. They looked through and copied or made notes on Boehmer's confidential personnel file at the college and encouraged college officials to bring disciplinary charges against Boehmer. And for the purpose, they say, for that, in the suit, was that they wanted Boehmer dismissed from his teaching post. And then in October 1971, as a direct result of the FBI's action, the college brought the charges of unprofessional conduct against Boehmer and sought his dismissal from his teaching position. In October 71, police department officers broke into and searched the residence of Boehmer and Tharp, another residence. They'd moved by that time, I suppose, in San Diego, while Boehmer was there. In November 1971 and afterwards, FBI officers approached members of the Committee to Stop the San Diego State Railroad, an organization of students and faculty members, others, which supported Boehmer's defense against the college proceedings to fire him. And they asked them to report on the activities of Boehmer and the committee that he belonged to. On November 13th, 1971, this is in the suit, SAO members, they say, set on fire a car parked in front of Boehmer's house. 2 days later, on November 15th, 1971, an SAO member called the residence and said to one of its occupants, "The car was just a warning." On November 13th, 1971, this is in the suit, SAO members, they say, set on fire a car parked in front of Boehmer's house. 2 days later, on November 15th, 1971, an SAO member called the residence and said to one of its occupants, "The car was just a warning. Next time we'll get the house."
On December 1st, 1971, members of the San Diego Police Department and SAO members and sheriff's officers, including Defendant Godfrey, subjected to surveillance peaceful and lawful demonstrations protesting Boehmer's disciplinary hearing. And on the 15th, or between the 15th of November and December 31st of 1971, SAO members left stickers bearing the name SAO on Boehmer's office door at the college and on his car and cars belonging to his roommates. On December 23rd and 25th of 1971, SAO members made telephone calls to Boehmer's residence. And the first caller said in sum, he wished Pete a Merry Christmas. It will be his last. This is the secret army organization. The second caller told Boehmer, "Merry Christmas. It will be your last. We know you're there alone. This is the Minutemen." On or about December 27th of 1971, SAO members distributed leaflets labeled SAO Special Bulletin, and these listed Boehmer's address and telephone number, card description and license number, the names of his associates, and his physical appearance, and said, "For any reader who may care to look up this red scum." Boehmer received a copy of the leaflet through the mail. The leaflet was prepared by Godfrey, and the printing of the leaflets was financed, at least in part, with FBI funds.
Godfrey, of course, was the FBI agent mentioned before in this suit. In late December 1971 and on January the 4th, 1972, Boehmer made complaints to the police department officers regarding the actions of the death threats of the SAO, but he received no response and was informed by the officers that they'd never heard of the SAO. Then on January 6, 1972, SAO members placed stickers on the door of Boehmer's college office and the house in which he lived.
They called after that and said, "This time we left a sticker, next time we may leave a grenade." This is the SAO. And the campaign of attack and intimidation continues to be listed in this suit, which is against the FBI, the local police, and sheriff's department, and against officers of the federal government from the president on down. And all of these allegations, in sum, constitute a campaign of harassment, including threats of death. And
fire bombings.
Not only were the threats of death made, but Godfrey has apparently stated that had he been given the direct order to carry out those threats, that he would have done so.
In one case in particular, the members of the Secret Army Association drove past Boehmer's house and fired off shots. Now, Boehmer wasn't in at the time, but Paula Tharp, who's the plaintiff in this suit, was in, and she was shot in the elbow and suffered a serious wound as a result. So these are some of the charges that the Church Committee will hopefully be looking into, this and other charges, of course, of misconduct by the FBI and by the Central Intelligence Agency.